everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I'm Carolyn Bennett-Glauda, the Programs and Outreach Manager at Southeastern New York Library Resources Council. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Unlocking the Mysteries of Directors and Officers Insurance for Libraries, Museums, and Other Cultural Organizations. Before starting the program, I'd just like to do some housekeeping. In addition to our chat about snow in the chat, I wanted to let you know that we had some overwhelming interest in today's webinar. There are almost 300 people registered. So we converted this Zoom meeting to a webinar, which you can probably have guessed by now. This means that only the presenters and the hosts have microphones and cameras enabled. So you can use the chat, and we encourage you to introduce yourself to the others there now and let us know if you got snow where you are. Just to make sure that your comment is going to everyone and not just the panelists and hosts, which I think is now the default is everyone. So during the meeting, if you have a question, you can use the Q&A feature to avoid it getting lost among the other comments that might come through. And we also want to make sure that you know Zoom offers automated captions. So to view them, click the Show Captions icon on your Zoom screen or click to the caret to see more options. I also want to let you know that all attendees are expected to follow Southeastern's Code of Conduct, and we will add that to the chat when I'm done with my introduction. So in short, just treat all staff, event attendees, and speakers respectfully. And if you don't adhere to the Code of Conduct, we will remove you from the meeting. As you can also see, we are recording today's event, and we will make the recording available to you as soon as we can upon the webinar's conclusion. So we will send you that link and a form to evaluate this panel discussion, as well as a request for a certificate of attendance. We will also share a link to the other webinars that Cole will host for us in the upcoming 5 months. So if you need anything, I'm going to be in the background throughout the meeting. You can contact me through chat if you need any technical assistance. And with that, I'm happy to turn over the program to Stephanie Cole Adams.
All right, thank you, Carolyn. Hello, everybody. Good morning on this rainy/snowy day. I'm glad we picked warm colors for what we're going to be sharing on the screen, because it's like we're all just cozying up, around the fire together to talk about directors and officers insurance. I can't think of a better way to spend a morning. I want to thank Kirsten from my office for being here. Kirsten's going to work with Carolyn to monitor the questions that you're going to put either into the chat or into the Q&A section. And that way I can just concentrate on walking you through things, but they're going to interrupt me as needed. And so if a question arises in the moment, I really encourage you to put it in. We really are, our theme for today is unlocking the mysteries, and I'd like to make sure it's unlocked for each and every one of you. So I'm not going to spend too much time on me. I work with a lot of libraries, and that work inspired this presentation, because boy, do we get a lot of questions about directors and officers insurance. And in the day-to-day legal work, we end up working with clients to use their directors and officers insurance a lot. So without further ado, just so you know, for clarity, in this presentation, an insurance policy, I'm always going to call an insurance policy an insurance policy. And whenever I say other policy, right, that's going to be a governing board policy. And we're going to be talking a lot about both of those. So when I'm referring to an insurance policy, it might sound a little repetitive, but I just want to make sure for clarity that you know when I'm talking about an insurance policy, that's what I'm talking about. Because of course, for our directors and trustees who are out there, you are dealing with policy all the time, right? So we'll just use that as a way to differentiate. So what is directors and officers insurance? I want to mention, we did get some questions in advance, and I've got them in front of me, and I'm going to try to weave the answers in at good spots. And we got a question that was, is the information we're going to discuss today generally applicable in states beyond New York? And I have to say, probably not. The concepts we're going to discuss, some of the red flags will probably be applicable, like the overall structure will be. But insurance is a creature of two things: law and contract, right? And law and contract changes from state to state. So the first slide we're looking at here, well, the first substantive slide is a quote from New York State Insurance Law, section 1113. There's so much insurance law in New York. And while almost every state is going to have some version, definitely, of number one, liability for being a director or a trustee that needs to be considered and is thus going to have some kind of insurance. The language and the rules do change from place to place. So I want to stress that today, when we're talking about some of this stuff, most of this stuff, it's going to be very New York specific. So there you have it on that question. So as you can see, in New York State, we have an insurance law, and there are different kinds of insurance that is authorized by law, and it's a highly regulated industry. We're not going to talk about that much at all, but for those of you who are leading libraries, you know that the general public isn't aware of the immense amount of law and regulation, right, that goes into running a library. The insurance industry is the same, right? There's a ton of legal infrastructure. But the big takeaway for this slide is that insurance in the state of New York, insurance carriers have to be licensed, right? And there are different kinds of insurance that are defined by law. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that every insurance policy is the same. One of the things we're going to spend a lot of time on this morning is that actually coverage varies greatly from policy to policy. So you'd think with all this law, right, that maybe we would have standards, and there is some standardization, but it's just like buying a car, right? You know, it's going to have wheels, it's going to have an engine, all that kind of stuff, but there's going to be a great deal of variety and a great deal of variety in capability and cost, right? But the point of this slide is really just that there are different kinds of insurance authorized, and it is controlled by law. So in New York, believe it or not, because this sounds a little counterintuitive, the majority of what is covered by a directors and officers policy is a type of personal injury coverage. Even though a lot of actual personal injury claims, like a slip and fall, are actually excluded from directors and officers insurance. So for those of you who are sitting or standing or doing whatever you're in your physical body as you're listening, I just want to encourage you to do a little exercise with me. Insurance is all about in and out, in and out. And what I mean by that is when an organization purchases insurance, it's going to say, here's what's covered. And then it's going to say, here's what's not covered. And then usually the policy will have additional sections that add things back in, but in a different way, right? And the reason I wanted to include this definition of personal injury or personal injury liability insurance from the New York State insurance law is to show, again, there's a certain type of coverage, it's defined, but an insurance policy may say, and we're going to do more, or we're going to do less. It's going to be in, it's going to be out. So again, the big takeaway here is not that you memorize, that there's an insurance law, but it's that what you've learned by going through one insurance policy is not necessarily going to apply in another insurance policy. And this is where insurance can be really challenging, especially for libraries, where of course we're very used to getting out there and sharing information, right? But the insurance analysis that one library would have done on their directors and officers policy, their D&O, won't necessarily apply to a library that's working with a different insurance carrier, right? It's very, very specific, even though a lot of the terminology is defined by law. And I'm going to pause for just a second and see if there's any questions on that.
Nothing so far, Cole.
All right, good. Everyone's with me. Maybe it was the in and out dance. So it's like, a little bit of insurance yoga. Okay, so why is it important to have? I mean, you all know that it's important to have because here you are on a Friday morning, right? Talking about insurance. So it's important to have because there is liability connected with being the trustee, which is an equivalent term to a director, right? And when they use the term director in the law here, they mean a person who's on a board of directors, right? Library trustees, museum trustees. Sometimes there is a museum board of directors, depending on the legal structure, right, that creates it. But basically, we're talking about the governing board, the executive director or director, and then for some larger organizations, like a larger cooperative library system, regional library council, maybe just a large public library, right? There are also going to be some other officers who might have liability connected with what they do. But as you can see, so this right here on the screen is an excerpt from the Not-for-Profit Corporations Law, which does apply to libraries, museums, and other New York State Education Department licensed and registered entities in New York. There is liability, but your organization should be protecting you. In other words, as long as you are, well, here, this is one we need to go over a little bit, right? So take a look at the screen, right? So except as provided, et cetera, et cetera. So this, I guess I'm gonna find my spot here. So you will not face liability based solely on your conduct in the execution of your office, either as a trustee or a director, unless your actions constitute gross negligence or were intended to cause harm, right? So in other words, the institution itself could be liable for all sorts of things: alleged contract violation, alleged personal injury, defamation, copyright infringement case, all these things. But as long as the individual people who were involved in that action, which may or may not be trustees, might be a director, could be, maybe a CFO, right? If the structure has that kind of officer, they will not be liable as long as they were not behaving with gross negligence. In other words, either grossly departing from policy or actually intending to harm the organization. One of the reasons it's important, this is a little side note, one of the reasons it's important to have policies governing your organization is because of this right here. Because if a director or an officer or a trustee can say, I was following the policy, right? We had an approved policy. The policy follows the law. I was following the policy. Then the individual trustee or director will not be held liable, with very, very few exceptions, as long as they were acting according to policy. In fact, as long as they're acting according to policy, they're safe, right? And the organization instead will be liable, but not the individual people. It's the same thing in corporate America, right? Where this is why you have corporations that can maybe be found responsible for things, but it's harder for the individual shareholders and leadership to be found liable for that same activity. So, okay, that was a lot. How does this all fit into your bylaws? So for those of you who have the worksheet that we're going to be going through, you know that you were asked to take a look at your bylaws and see if it has an indemnification provision and some other things. So section 722 of the Not-for-Profit Corporation Law, which does apply to all types of public libraries, museums, archives, right? Chartered not-for-profit educational corporations. So these organizations are, under the Not-for-Profit Corporation Law, allowed to indemnify the directors, the officers, the trustees for the kinds of liability that they could be accused of, right? What is indemnification? Think of indemnification as a shield that is put in front of you, right? In other words, the organization, maybe that liability is coming right at you, but the organization is going to step in, right? And it's going to protect you personally, to the point where, we did get one question that asked for some examples of how this plays out, and I'm definitely going to provide that. And here comes the first one. So my office once worked with a library that was named in an age discrimination case. And not only did the person who was bringing that case name the library itself, but they did list individual trustees who they felt had engaged in age discrimination. And even before we started doing all the defenses and all that kind of thing, the first thing I did was say, we need to take these individual people off of here. They were clearly acting in according to policy, right? They made decisions in their capacity as trustees and as a director. There is nothing here that, rises to the level of gross negligence. They are indemnified by the corporation, and the corporation really should be stepping in and taking the hit for them, taking that liability for them. And that was done, right? So that's one of the ways that this all plays together. So because the law allows indemnification, which is that sort of, we're going to stand in front of you, the organization is going to take the hit. It is not required for things to operate this way, but is a good thing to have in bylaws. And we're going to spend some more time talking about that. And another part of the New York State not-for-profit corporation law, section 726, after the law says, yes, you can, the organization can indemnify the directors, the officers, the trustees, they can step in, they can be that shield, right? They say not only can they be that shield, but they can buy insurance. Because it's one thing to say, oh, don't sue our trustee for age discrimination, right? Sue the library, sue the museum, right? Sue the entity that you think did the bad thing. That's very helpful. But if there isn't insurance to back that up, it's going to get very expensive to give that indemnification, because all the liability that could attach with that claim, and again, I'm not just talking about age discrimination. We're going to talk about what does D&O typically cover, but definitely copyright infringement, trademark infringement, theft of trade secrets, violation of an employment contract, a lot of things, right? A lot of those liabilities that someone would say, well, the organization and the trustees, maybe they're all responsible. All of that, with very rare exceptions, is insurable. And different insurance, usually called D&O, can be purchased, directors and officers insurance, can be purchased to not only have the organization provide that indemnification, but be able to pay for it. It's kind of like saying, not only did we say we did this, but we've got the coverage, we've got the money, and we've got the resources to live up to our indemnification. An indemnification without insurance is debatably not helpful unless the organization has a lot of money in reserve to cover the potential liability. Most directors and officers insurance covers, by the way, not only whatever the verdict might be if there is a finding of liability, but it covers at least some, if not all, of the legal fees that are associated with the claim. And we're gonna spend more time on that. But that's how this all plays together, right? We have the ability of the organization to provide the indemnification, and then by law, even though, and any one of your libraries or institutions cannot just buy you things, right? They can't buy you a car. They can't buy you a special outfit to wear to the board meetings, right? They can't, your organization can't buy you things, but they can buy insurance to cover your indemnification, right? And the law allows that. Okay, so hopefully that all lines up. Hopefully that makes sense, right? There is some liability. Your organization can indemnify the directors and the officers and the trustees. And not only can they indemnify them, but they can buy insurance. That part makes sense. And then after that, it's just the Wild West out there. And I'm not going to go through this, but if you want to give this, take a look at what I've got on the screen. This is just an example of how this stuff plays out in the real world, because insurance coverage is very often, it's when does the coverage have to actually cover things, right? So some insurance carriers are fantastic and are very upfront about what they cover and don't cover. Sometimes it can get a little vague, and sometimes there's something new arises where the carrier will say, guess what? We said we would cover this, but something has happened and now we think we're not going to cover. So this case that I have here is just an example of how bankruptcy can affect the obligation or the entitlement to having directors and officers insurance. I'm not putting this in there here for you to memorize so much as just to say, we're going to go over the very simple steps to find and confirm your directors and officers insurance. And our goal in doing that is to make sure that when you need it, if you ever need it, you have great clarity on what kind of coverage you have, what it covers, how you use it, and how your carrier will help you out, how your insurance carrier will help you out. So that's because it can be cold out there in the insurance world. So what are the takeaways right now before we really start delving into it? If acting within their authority and in good faith, directors and officers for not-for-profit organizations are generally not personally liable for the claims that are made against their institution or are made as part of their work for the institution. This is why it's important to follow your bylaws, follow your policies, and have good policy, especially with respect to employment and things that are controlled by law or things that are high risk, maintenance of the property, things like that. However, as you heard in the story I told, a trustee, a director, an officer, an executive director can still be personally named in a legal claim. When people, file complaints with the New York State Division of Human Rights, which is where a lot of discrimination cases are brought, or with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or if they file an Article 78, which for the public libraries who are here, like municipal and village libraries, an Article 78 is a type of claim that might be directed at you. If there's a appeal to the New York State Education Commissioner. So I'm listing, by the way, this is me listing different types of claims that might involve some D&O coverage, right? All of those things can still, if I'm a trustee, they can say, Stephanie Adams right there in the caption. But then there's an ability to say, well, number one, Stephanie Adams is indemnified, right? So really this case should be against the institution. We're going to take the hit for her. And we've got insurance to cover it, right? So even if my name stays there or, my name has to be taken off, like the example I gave a little bit ago, there's still protection, okay? An indemnification, either in the bylaws, which would be for employees, or in a contract, can set the extent and the terms under which the officer or director will be held harmless. In other words, there's going to be an indemnification. There's going to be insurance for it if we've promised that as an organization. But you have to follow our rules, right? You have to follow our rules in order to qualify for the coverage. If we're at a board meeting and someone stands up and I've said something a little bit controversial and they pop me in the face, right? If a trustee punches me, engages in the act of assault, chances are that's against the policy of the library. And chances are they will not be indemnified because they did something that was clearly over the top and against the rules. So the coverage won't be there for that. But the D&O policy can ensure the institution has the insurance coverage to live up to the indemnification, which is basically telling me, Stephanie Adams, if you follow the rules and somebody still tries to, claim liability against you and or the institution, we're going to protect you and we've got the insurance to do it. So that's the takeaways there. Any questions so far?
Not so far.
Okay. All right, so now everyone's got their worksheet. We're going to discuss how to assess your D&O. So the first one is, do the bylaws have an indemnification provision? All right, and why is that important? Because, well, for many reasons. Number one, really savvy trustees. Trustees are really who are experienced, or potential trustees, potential board members who are savvy about these kinds of things. The first thing they will do if they're invited to be on your board is they will ask to see the bylaws and they will look for this because they will be looking to make sure that they are protected. So if the bylaws currently do not have an indemnification provision, it doesn't mean you're out of compliance, right? So in the grand scheme of things, this is not a panic, get this done today kind of thing. But, coming into 2025, it would be a really good thing to take a look and say, oh, do we want to have an assurance of indemnification in our bylaws? It's a good idea. So when you are assessing your organization's need for directors and officers insurance, so let's say you either have D&O or you may have D&O, but you're not sure. Maybe you've been told you have it through your municipality, or you don't have any directors and officers insurance. This worksheet was designed to help you know, okay, where do we stand as we undertake that analysis and figure out what we're going to do next. So as you'll see, the sheet says, okay, if the answer, let us know, is the answer yes or no? If the answer is yes, attach a copy of the bylaws. If the answer is no, then your bylaws are kind of neutral on this. But you can always make a note of, oh, do we want to amend the bylaws to include that? Any questions on that one?
No, not so far.
All right. Does the organization, so we're going to go to item 2 on the chart. Okay. Does the organization, I keep saying organization, I know most people here are probably from libraries, but I know we've got other cultural organizations who are attending as well. Does the organization have a policy about indemnification or paying legal costs for directors, trustees, officers, and employees? So there might be not only a provision in the bylaws. Oh, yes.
I'm sorry, Cole. I was looking in the wrong spot for questions. So yes, there have been questions.
Okay.
That's my fault.
Hit me.
Karen Wyckoff says, listening closely for what to do on one of my boards. The nonprofit just formed in June, still waiting for our official federal approval of our nonprofit status. We formed in order to bring legal action, so we had already begun that when we started looking for D&O Insurance. What we have found so far is that no one is willing to sell us insurance because we are already involved in legal action. Do you know of any options?
It's interesting. So, I imagine if there isn't an insurance advisor or broker, and let me talk about the difference. So there are insurance brokers. An insurance broker is, of course, the person who brokers the deal to get the insurance, and they usually take a percentage. And so at the end of the day, because they're taking that percentage, an insurance broker is trying to sell you insurance. Which means that even though they might be a really great person and a fabulous broker who actually is going to find you the perfect coverage, there's at least a little bit of a profit motive in what they do, right? There are also out there what are called insurance consultants. Insurance consultants are kind of like attorneys. They get paid by the hour, right? And they do not take a percentage, and they should be ethically barred from not taking a percentage of what insurance they might advise that your organization gets or doesn't get. So if there's been, if some calls have gone out to some different carriers, or you've been working with a broker and the broker can't find the coverage, I would say, number one, take a look and see if there's an insurance consultant who focuses on not-for-profits. And they're out there, right? You can Google them to try and find that person. And then, and the beautiful thing, because something like current litigation shouldn't be a absolute bar, because what the carrier can say is, sure, we're going to cover you for all the things: copyright violation, trademark, contract, employment claims, all these kinds of things. However, we're not going to cover you for the current litigation you're in. So, and they may say that because they don't like it, or they may say, look, the coverage isn't going to start until right now, and there's no look back period, right? So, but I would say, if the organization has the capacity, finding an insurance advisor, not a broker, to try and solve that problem might be a worthwhile endeavor, especially if the organization is going to continue doing some of the other things that are high risk, like, fundraisers, conducting events, getting out there, having people out there talking, right? Engaging in really vigorous advocacy. So it's worth it to have the D&O, and, finding a carrier. So again, sometimes the carrier will say, well, it's okay, we're going to cover you from this point going forward, but we're not covering you for, anything related to the litigation. So yes, that would be one technique, but you might even find someone who's just able to find like coverage. The problem is the cost might go up, right? So you can always get the coverage, almost always. It's just the cost will go up. So do we have another question?
Yes. So does this insurance also cover the obligations of the institution itself when it is sued for something?
Yes, so does it, right. So usually the directors and officers coverage will cover, again, different types of claims that are related to the action of the leadership. So classic example would be a contract violation. So let's say you hire an insurance consultant, and that person is not as great as you thought they would be, and you want to end the contract, you follow the termination provisions, but they sue saying, oh no, I was supposed to work for your organization, you owe me money, right? And now you're in litigation. If the D&O policy that was purchased covers contract violation, which some do, some don't, right? If that type of claim is within the scope of the coverage, then there would be coverage not only for the any individual people, but yes, for the institution who was alleged to have violated the contract. Yes, good question. What do we
Okay.
have next?
So to clarify, indemnification in bylaws only covers trustees. Employees, for example, directors, need to be by contract.
It doesn't have to be that way. So an indemnification provision can cover the trustees and the officers. So usually in the bylaws, not always, the director or an executive director is listed as an officer of the organization. And usually they will be covered. I do think if the dots can't be connected, it is good for a director to have that assurance in writing. And we're going to talk about how all that gets linked up. And, particular employees, like as long as the employee, so let's say you have a marketing director, right? Maybe you have a large enough organization that you have a whole marketing department or at least one marketing director or a fundraising person, right? Who's out there and, maybe they are alleged to say something defamatory and a case comes in and it says, oh, your library or your museum defamed me. And so did your head spokesperson or your marketing person. The indemnification can cover them as well. Yes, absolutely. But oh, go ahead. Yep.
And should the bylaws use both the words indemnification and insurance?
I think we're getting to that, but yes, it will say, there will be an indemnification provision saying that the directors, the trustees, the officers are indemnified for what they do as part of their work for the organization. And then another section saying the board is authorized to secure insurance to cover the indemnification. Yep. So it should be two things. Yes. And in some bylaws, I've seen this take 2 pages because the attorney who wrote the bylaws just went for broke and basically copied and pasted the law pretty much word for word into the bylaws. That's fine. And I've seen them be very, very short and efficient. And that can also be fine. Because at the end of the day, as long as the insurance carrier agrees, yes, you have coverage. Yes, this coverage covers your trustees, your library director, maybe your other officers, maybe even your other employees who you're asking to do things. As long as there's a alignment between all of those different commitments, then the coverage will be there. And that's the safety net that you're looking for the organization.
Okay, I'm starting to get questions both in the chat and in the Q&A. I wonder if we could stick to using the Q&A so that I don't lose my place. Someone asked what terms they should use when asking the town if they carry this type of insurance.
Oh, yes. Okay. Let's see here. I'm gonna just make sure. We're gonna cover that. So I'll do a little bit more on the sheet and we're going to talk about that because that's very important. That's very, very important. So we'll go over a couple more factors and then we'll pick back up. So does the organization have a policy about indemnification? So we just talked about that, right? And again, you're looking for that language in your bylaws. If it's not there, that's okay. You need to know that as part of the exercise of assessing, is our insurance good enough? Do we even have the insurance? Do we want to get more or buy some for the first time? So, does the organization have any contractual obligations to indemnify, defend, and pay for costs of the director? So, very typically, especially at a larger organization, if like an executive vice president is on the team, a president, so what you're going to call C-suite executives, things like that, those folks will have contractual provisions. They don't have to, but personally, I'll just put this out there. It's a little controversial, so buckle up. I think it's fine for a lot of libraries to offer their directors contracts. I think it provides protection for the director, as well as for the library if it's done right. And I think as part of that, especially given the trend of some of the risks that library directors are facing with respect to the attitude of the public about libraries at times, right? I think it's fine for a library to say, yes, you are indemnified, and yes, we have insurance. Number one, that's pretty much the way things should operate by default. But for a library director to have that type of assurance, I think can make them feel a lot better, make them feel secure that the coverage is there, and that the indemnification is assured. It'll remind everyone of that in the event that the coverage is needed. And like I said, typically the default is that the director will be covered anyway, right? Even if it's not listed in the bylaws, even if it's not listed in a policy, most insurance policies, with very rare exceptions, will cover the key employees, of which the library director is always a key employee, right? So one of the things we're talking about is alignment between the bylaws and any policies or obligations and the insurance coverage. At the end of the day, if your bylaws overpromise or your contract overpromises and the insurance underdelivers, that's a problem. So where we're going here is we're on a journey to make sure that if you have these promises, the insurance will back them up. But I'm also here to say that I've had clients who, when I said, hey, you've been threatened with this lawsuit, have you let the insurance carrier know? And they say, no. And then, of course, we let the insurance carrier know, right? Because there might be coverage. They find out there's coverage. They find out there's coverage for things they had no idea that they had coverage for. A great example of this is copyright trolls, right? So I don't see it happening quite as much as I saw it happening 5 years ago, but it still happens where, if a library, let's say they're creating a poster and they happen to grab a picture, maybe they think it's in the public domain, maybe they think they have permission to use the picture, but it turns out that they don't, or allegedly they don't, and they get a demand for, $2,000 from a copyright troll. If anybody has had that experience, feel free to pop that into the chat. Most D&O covers alleged copyright infringement, right? It's sometimes under the category of advertising injury. So I'll get a call saying, oh my goodness, Cole, we've been threatened with, a copyright lawsuit. What are we going to do? Same thing. I say, don't worry, we can try and figure this out, but have you called your insurance carrier yet? Because you may have coverage. And many times there is coverage, and the insurance carrier at that point, I happily say to them, guess what? You don't need me, because the insurance carrier is going to use their in-house counsel to negotiate this and get this done for you, right? And it becomes just a very almost boring, rote situation, right? Even though it starts out with like high panic, like, oh my goodness, we got threatened with this lawsuit, right? Oh, is there coverage? Yes, there is. Great. Carrier's going to handle it. You're all done. Now, I will say that every time the insurance carrier handles a claim, you might be looking at your rates going up. So I'm not saying stop worrying about following the law because the insurance carrier is going to cover it. Because as we talked about, different things will have an impact on how much the insurance premium is. But many, many times there's coverage, right? Even though people don't know there's coverage. And again, it's fine to have more coverage than you're required to have. What we want to make sure is that if the bylaws and contracts require a certain amount of coverage, you at least have that baseline coverage. And the real point is we want to make sure you have coverage for the typical types of risks that your organization is going to be facing, right?
Okay, we've got a couple of questions regarding who is covered. Is the assistant director covered?
They should be, yes.
How about staff who are not director level?
It probably will be, as long as they are acting according to policy and doing their job. And so, and here's actually, I'm going to give an example on that one, because this is really important with social media. So if, just as one example, if you have a staff member who is on the library Facebook account and says something, maybe it's not defamatory, maybe it's not mean at all, or maybe it's true, which is an absolute defense, right, to defamation. But you get threatened with litigation, and that person is your children's librarian, right? They end up getting into a tete-a-tete. As long as that employee is following the policy of the library for engaging in social media. This is why it's important to have a social media policy if your library is using social media, right? As long as that person is acting according to policy, most likely when you look at the D&O coverage, it will say who's covered, employees, right? Or, you know, it'll say who's considered a covered person. It's usually an employee who's taking action on behalf of the library. So again, as long as that person is taking action according to policy, they're not engaging in gross negligence, they weren't actively trying to harm the organization, right? Then there will be coverage. So, you know, of all the things we're talking about taking a look at, the most important thing, and we're going to get to it, is if you have a policy, is actually having a copy of the policy and looking and reading who's covered. That is the most important thing. Well, aside from having the coverage in the first place, right? But taking a good look at the policy. And a lot of times, an insurance broker will get you your coverage and will say, here's your policy. And you'll get like a 1 or 2 sheet thing that is a summary, right? It's called an insurance summary. And it'll say, you know, you're insured for about $2 million for D&O. Here's your deductible. We're going to talk about deductibles in a minute, right? Here's your insurance summary. That is not the policy. Your library needs to have a copy of the policy. They are usually about 100 pages long, give or take. And as I said earlier, they usually consist of a core policy, insurance policy, excuse me, a core insurance policy, and then some what are called either riders or exclusions, like additional addendums, right? And that ends up being anywhere from 40 to 200 pages. It really depends. And sometimes the D&O coverage, the D&O insurance policy might even be mishmashed in there with the general liability insurance policy. And you have a 300-page document to go through. And trust me, it's a pain. Like when I go through these, I end up using a big table and a highlighter, and I have to go through because, you know, it's all about saying, here's the coverage. Oh, we're taking this out. Oh, we're putting this back in. That's what happens. Okay. But to get back to the original question, yes, an employee will be covered typically, as long as they are actually doing their job, and they're doing their job according to policy. This is why job descriptions and policies and all these things lining up is so important, because you don't want to give the carrier a reason to say, no, this person's job wasn't social media. They were just out there saying this on their own. Coverage denied, right? That's what you don't want. So, you know, all these things line up. And the reason I provided that excerpt about the bankruptcy case before is just to show these things really do turn on a dime and on you know, semicolons and tiny little distinctions. So, all right, Kirsten, what do you do? Is there a question out there I should?
You keep saying excuse me, I'm trying to paraphrase. You keep saying bylaws. Could it be in a policy, a board policy instead?
Absolutely. Yes, it can. Yes. And the only difference there really is that, I mean, you're allowed to have it in the bylaws, and the bylaws are generally more public facing documents, although they're not always, but yes, having it in a policy is fine. Just making sure that that policy, that board policy, is regularly reviewed. Part of the challenge with library boards, if there's a lot of turnover in trustees, and of course that varies from library to library, is these things will get set up, but then people will forget about them. So just making sure that however it's set up in a way that is routinely evaluated so that the board has a working familiarity with what's set up at all times. Yeah.
Do you know of any resources that show model language for bylaws and policies?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And I would say actually starting with the language from the law is like, so I mentioned that, you know, there's some bylaws out there that are just really long, dense bylaws, and it's because they decided to just quote the law in the bylaws. That's fine. It doesn't have to happen that way. I think starting with the law is the way to do it, and then paring down from there. But there are good models out there. I think it's important if you're going to be taking a look, it's important to assemble all the documents that I've been talking about though in the analysis. Because again, you just want everything to fit together and make sure that, you know, there's an emphasis on people doing the jobs that they are hired to do, following the job description, keeping the job descriptions up to date, keeping, you know, all of the policies up to date, and regularly reviewing the insurance policy. So I want to talk about this because this is a huge piece, and we had a question about it, and it gets a little bit intricate. So number 5 on the chart is, does your organization get any type of insurance coverage from another entity, such as a town, school district, or parent company, right? And the reason this is important, right? Sometimes local libraries, historical societies, et cetera, get different types of insurance from other entities. This impacts how much D&O an organization might need to arrange on its own. So this is a really important one for those of you who are, you know, this is mainly going to impact the village and town libraries, but it can, in historical societies as well, but it can really impact almost everybody. If you have been told, even told in writing, yes, you have general premises liability, which is, you know, sort of like slip and fall coverage for your general premises, and or you have D&O for your trustees and for, you know, the employees, for the library director, et cetera. If you've been told that, it's wonderful that they've told you that. It's wonderful that they've emailed that. You must get a copy of the policy, not the summary, the policy. And the reason is because I've had at least 2 instances in the last year where a library was assured that in writing, as in they got the email, you know, oh yeah, you're covered. But when push came to shove, that coverage was not so assured. And that is not the time you want to be finding out that there's no coverage. So I just want to give you a pep talk on this. If your village or town has said, oh yeah, you're covered. Again, you thank them and say that's wonderful. In order to recruit a wide array of trustees, including trustees who are very experienced when it comes to issues about directors and officers insurance, we need to see a copy of the policy. And I will say this, if the policy does not list the library as part of coverage, right? If you go through that whole, whatever it is, 40 pages, 100 pages, 300 pages, right? And you don't see library employees, library trustees listed as covered, at the very least, you should get assurance from the actual insurance carrier that the library is covered. But really, the policy should be changed to specifically list the library. This is so important. And even if a library was told 5 years before, oh yeah, you're covered, no problem, you're always with us, right? The insurance carrier might actually disagree with that. In other words, the town or the village might think that in a bona fide way. But to an insurance carrier who, remember, thinks in highly precise, insurance-informed terms, your library, no matter what kind of library it is, no matter who administers the payroll for your library is a separate corporate entity. And in contract world, that means if it's not on that policy, you might not be covered. And there is only one way, right? There's only one way to know this for sure. And it is to say, we need a copy of the policy, of the current policy, not the policy from the year before, the current policy. And you need to see that the library is listed there. The library trustees, the library employees are listed on the policy, not just the library building. Because very often if a town or a village owns the library building, absolutely the building and the premises will be covered for general premises liability, right? For slip and fall, you know, books falling on a patron, you know, that would be horrible. I hope that doesn't happen. But anyway, but that's very different from the directors and officers insurance, which is the types of things we've been talking about: copyright, trademark, contract violation, defamation, those kinds of things. A lot of employment related claims. So it is very important to get a copy of the policy. And if you don't see the library listed under the D&O, to either have the library specifically added. And remember, if the library is covered, that should not be a hard thing at all. If the library is already covered, the carrier should be like, oh yeah, sure, that's not a problem, right? If the carrier is just like, no, then that means that carrier didn't regard the library as having coverage in the first place, right? In my experience, municipal leaders get really cagey about this stuff, and it can get really, really delicate. But it is really important. Of course, it's not important unless you lose the litigation lottery and either your institution or your trustees or your director get named in an action, but that is not the time to find out. So it's a very simple thing, right? You know, and it's written right here. If your organization is assured that it is covered by another village, town, etc., get a copy of the policy and verify that the coverage pertains to your library with the carrier. And that can be done either with written assurance from the carrier, or you see the library listed in the policy for the D&O. So I'm just going to stop because I know this is a really big one. This one's really, really important. And for those of you, you know, from the municipal and libraries or the school district libraries, if your school district is helping with coverage and things like that, this is really important. So I'm just going to stop for a second and see if we got any questions on this. And I'm going to take some.
In a small library, who should be in charge of reviewing and maintaining copies of the insurance policies? Is that the director or the board president?
We're going to talk about that. Yeah, I have strong feelings on that. So that's a great question. You're going to thank you for that question. We are going to definitely cover that.
If there's nothing listed in the bylaws and no policy mentions it, does that imply there's no D&O?
So no, not at all. Not at all. Right. And one of the takeaways here is that while it's optimal to have the indemnification and the insurance listed in the bylaws or in a separate policy passed by the board, right? The real important thing, if you had to ask me which one's more important, actually have an insurance policy or have these things listed in the bylaws, actually having the coverage and knowing the coverage applies to your library and to your trustees and to your workers, to your officers, much more important, right? Ideally, you have them all, right? It's just one big, cozy, well-coordinated package. But at the end of the day, you want to know you have the directors and officers insurance in place. And one thing we're going to talk about is deductibles as well. So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you're prioritizing out there, making sure you have the D&O and that it covers what you think it covers is the most important part.
Does it cover library volunteers, or how about friends of the library?
Yeah, that's a great question. So library volunteers, it can. Some insurance carriers will have a volunteer, what's called a rider, like an additional little piece. Sometimes there's like an extra charge, like $55 a year, right, for the volunteer rider. Sometimes it's just part of the coverage and it'll actually save. So remember, I talked about you get the copy of the policy and then you take a look and you see when it says who's covered, see if it says volunteers. So I went through one the other day that had a really good, it was like a Cadillac D&O, right? And it had, it covered the volunteers as long as they were volunteering, participating in volunteer activities for the library, right? And so absolutely it can. This is where it won't automatically. So even though there is this thing called directors and officers insurance, and there's a category of different kinds of legal claims that it can cover. There's no assurance. Just knowing that you have a D&O policy is not enough. You have to have the list of what is covered, what is excluded, and really importantly, what is the deductible? I once had a client who they had D&O and they had D&O for certain types of employment related claims. The deductible was $75,000. In other words, they weren't going to get any help from the carrier until they spent $75,000 on the case, right? And that is a huge deductible. Now it was a very low premium, right? We're going to talk about budgeting for this kind of thing in a little bit too, because it's you don't have to have a low deductible or no deductible, but if you do have a high deductible, it's really important to make sure you have some type of contingency fund to bridge that gap until the insurance kicks in, right? Okay. So this next one on the sheet is the simple question: does your organization have any directors and officers coverage? And as I just said, there's no one type of D&O. The insurance policies vary widely in what they cover. And as we've been reviewing, generally D&O is going to cover things like wrongful termination, non-physical personal injury, such as defamation, negligent hiring. What is negligent hiring? Negligent hiring is, so let's say a library hires someone and there is ample newspaper coverage, right? Simple Google search will show that that person got fired from their last 3 places of employment for stealing from their coworkers and identity theft of coworkers. And then guess what? Shocker, they steal the identity of one of their coworkers now at your library, right? And causing damage, right? Causing a personal injury. That would be an example of a negligent hire. Directors and officers insurance will very often cover that. Unintentional discrimination, right? So not malicious in your face discrimination, but the kind that can accidentally happen. And believe me or not, it can. So for instance, a good example of unintentional discrimination is, let's say you have a library that for many, many years, they let people negotiate, there was a practice of negotiating compensation. And we all know that some people are better at negotiating compensation than others. If over time that led to the library, for instance, compensating one type of person differently than another type, men versus women, maybe a racial differential, even a religious differential, something like that. But it really wasn't intentional. It evolved over time, but nevertheless, it's still discriminatory in its overall cumulative effect. That's an example of unintentional discrimination. It can be a very strong legal claim. Most D&O will not cover allegations of like in your face, absolute out and out sexism, racism, but they will cover things where it's like unintentional. This is where the definitions in the policy get really, really dicey. Very important to read. And then, yeah, so we'll leave it at that. So it's important to read those things, but take a look at what you actually have right now. And this is where, if you take a look at the policy and you're just like, oh my gosh, how much time does Cole think I have? This is where if you have a trustee who knows about insurance, maybe they used to work in the industry, or the library can retain an insurance advisor. For people who spend a lot of time with these policies, it's a few hours at most to go through and say, here's what you think you need, here's what you have, you're good, you're not. And you can get a written analysis from them to see. I'm going to pause there for a second, just see if there's a question on that. Okay. All right.
No, but how long do you have to keep policies from prior years?
Oh, yes. At least, so let's see here. For those of you who are at anything but an association library, so for those of you who are at a quasi-public institution, you have to follow the LGS1 schedule, and I believe the retention period for those policies, I'm going to say hold on to it forever until you look at your records policy and decide otherwise. And the reason I say that is because you want to have a copy of the policy for as long as a claim could be made against it. So there's a retention period in there. I have not memorized it. If your library has a records retention and destruction policy, follow that. If it doesn't have that, which it should, hold on to it forever, because it's a contract that you entered into that you want to be able to benefit from. So I have to default to that answer.
With respect to negligent hiring, the querent asks, but I thought there were problems with a Google search before hiring. Is that not a sensitive issue any longer?
Oh, no, it absolutely is a sensitive issue. Oh, yeah. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to mention this. So in the state of New York, if someone has a criminal conviction, employers and educators cannot deny either an employment or an educational opportunity simply on the basis of a person having a conviction. There is actually a 9-part analysis that if you're conducting a hiring process and either someone discloses or a background check discovers that they have a conviction, you simply can't say, oh, they have a conviction, we can't think about them. Instead, you have to go through and do an analysis, and it really involves, it's very common sense at the end of the day, because it's looking at, well, what was the crime? How long ago was it? How old was the person when it was committed? And what is the job we're asking them to do, right? So someone convicted of identity theft 3 years before, and you're going to be bringing them on maybe as an assistant director who's going to have access to purchasing information and all sorts of confidential library records. At the end of the day, there would probably be a justification to say, this is not a good fit. When a decision is made along those lines, that decision has to be made in writing, and the person against whom it is made has a right to request a copy. So yes, if your library is ever using any information about a conviction, no matter where it comes from, the internet, a background search, a self-disclosure, any decision that uses that information must be based upon the analysis I just described, and you should have a background check policy that covers that. However, all of that I just said doesn't change the fact that there is a type of legal claim called a negligent hire, and the example I gave is a classic example of a negligent hire. It's called being between a rock and a hard place. Like this is why HR is can be really difficult, right? Because it's a tightrope act. On the one hand, you can't bring in someone who, if you had knowledge that they would pose a risk, right? If it was reasonable that you could say, oh my goodness, this person's going to pose a risk. If that risk happens, there could be liability for negligence, right? At the same time, absolutely, here in New York, it is a civil rights violation up and down to simply make a decision without going through the required analysis with respect to a criminal conviction. Yes. So thank you for the opportunity for me to draw that out a little bit more.
We noticed you carved out association libraries. How long do they need to keep policies?
Yes. So after the last possible claim could be made on the contract, I would say save it for another 3 years. You can decide. You want to save the copy for as long as there could possibly be an insurance claim related to that. And then after that, don't save things that you don't need. Yes. So, and unfortunately, that's going to change depending on what types of claims are being covered. So if you have a claim that one of the many, many different kinds of subsets that could come under D&O or sometimes travels with D&O, even though it's a separate insurance package, is against sexual abuse and molestation, right? It's for organizations that provide a lot of services to children or vulnerable populations. It's a type of coverage, for allegations of, again, abuse, sexual abuse and molestation. Those claims now for a while are there's a longer tailback on those. So, just taking a look and saying, okay, what's covered and, what are we relying on to be covered? Okay, when's the last possible claim that could be made with respect to this policy? And then saying, okay, we don't need it anymore. So yes, the good news is you can save them electronically. I'll say that. So if your organization has D&O, what kinds of claims are covered? As I've said, there's a vast array of things that D&O covers and that typically covers, but every policy is different. And there are riders and add-ons that you can purchase, sometimes for really relatively small amounts of money that are worth it. So just to put that out there, right? And that's why reading the policy and developing a summary of what actually are you covered for is so important. And a good carrier will give you a plain language summary. So, taking a look at your policy, if you have it, you definitely want to look at what types of claims are excluded. Exclusions are listed in the policy. They're usually like a secondary addendum to the policy. So if you look at the main policy, you'll say, wow, look at all this coverage we have. Then you look at the exclusions and say, oh, we thought we had this much coverage, but now we have this much coverage. What happened? Right? So it's just important to take a look at the whole policy, all of the exclusions, all the riders. And then sometimes there's also something called endorsements, which are things that put coverage back in even after they've been excluded. Yes, it's a pain. So if another question to ask is, if your organization currently has a D&O policy, what is the total amount of coverage? So in other words, how much are you insured for in a given year? Some policies, typical amounts are 1 million, 3 million, 5 million is pretty rare. That would be a huge claim, right? And then taking a look and saying, okay, well, is that the total coverage or is that the coverage per incident? And the document will say that. Your organization, the risks faced by your organization are going to change depending on what activities you do. So just as an example, a very small suburban library, right, that has a very minimal social media footprint, very few employees, doesn't engage, and doesn't do a heck of a lot of contracting with, outsiders, right? The less your library is engaging in the kinds of things that are covered by D&O. I'm not saying you don't need D&O, but do you need 3 million? Probably not. Do you need 1 million? That's a good place to start. 2 million tends to be where a lot of default, right? So taking a look at your, as a board member, one of the things that's good is to take a look at the overall risks of the organization, right? What is the organization actually doing? And then how does that fit in with our total amount of coverage? And I am going to talk about the question of who does all this work, right? All this homework I'm talking about, we're going to talk about that. So then just mentioned, not only what is the total coverage, what is the coverage per incident, right? So you might have something that says 2 million total, but 1 million per incident. So you have to limit yourselves to, like 2 incidents per year, right? And then we talked about this, what is the deductible? Sometimes that's called retention, right? But what is the deductible per claim? You can get very often you can get a much more less expensive, a less expensive premium. If you have a higher deductible, that's okay, as long as if you do have a claim, you have some kind of available, right? Maybe if your library regularly has a cash reserve, right? An unrestricted cash reserve of 300,000, and you decide to have a very high deductible because you would pay that deductible out of that cash reserve, that's fine, right? That, as long as that's been thought through, that's okay. Whether or not your organization currently has coverage, your board should consider these common risks that are often covered by D&O. So I just mentioned, so we're going to talk a little bit about who does what here, okay? All of this is very laborious, as you can probably tell. And either if a library director is asked to do this, that needs to be acknowledged, and they need to have the time to do this. This is not something that you just do, 10 minutes here, 10 minutes there, right? Preparing an analysis like this takes many, many hours. Keeping it updated takes many, many hours. It can be done by a director, and in some cases, they might be the person who knows the most about the library's operations. It can also be done by a board committee, like a risk committee or an executive committee, and it could be done in collaboration, right? So here's some of the things to think about. What's the likelihood of a wrongful termination claim? This is some pretty simple math. The more employees you have, the more likely that could be there. However, if there's a union environment where it would become a union grievance, right, before an actual legal claim, that might reduce the risk. How likely is there to be a copyright claim? This is the more your library is or your institution is putting content out there, right? Trademark claims, same thing. Harassment and discrimination, defamation, allegations of workplace violence, and that could go along with that negligent hire I talked about. A wrongful denial of services claim. So some D&O coverage actually has, and some doesn't. Like I said, the menu varies from coverage to coverage. So one of the risks of running a public institution is someone who maybe you've had to tell someone who they came to the library for the third time, and for the third time they screamed at someone and were creating a really threatening and hostile environment, hostile in the sense of people feeling hostile. They violated the code of conduct, you've documented it, and now you have to tell that person, sorry, you were not allowed on the premises for 6 months, right? We had a library ban, right? So another word for that, if it done wrongfully, would be a wrongful denial of services. So there is insurance coverage for that. And it's actually, if you look at the kinds of legal cases that are brought against public libraries, it's one of the ones that ends up in the courts, right? Because it's among other things, it's a civil rights claim, especially for a non-association library. So if that is something that is likely to happen, if you have a population of people who, maybe, again, this is the bigger the library and the more people you're serving, the more likely it is to happen, just statistically, right? So that's worth checking out. Breach of contract. How many contracts is your library engaging in a year? How many performers is it bringing in, right? Is it hiring people to do murals? So breach of contract is another typical thing. So either the director or a committee of trustees or people working together kind of saying, what are our risks? Not everything that could go wrong, but what are the most likely things to go wrong? One thing I didn't put on here, but is really important is, do you allow community organizations to use your space? And specifically, do you allow community organizations that are serving children to use your space? Because sometimes if there's a personal injury claim that's based on alleged abuse of a minor, that claim brought by the personal injury attorney who's filing it will not just name the organization who is borrowing space in your library, but will also name your library, right? Because it was the location. And you'd like to make sure that it'd be good to have insurance coverage for that. Even if your library is going to get out of that lawsuit because you're going to be able to show, look, we had nothing to do with that. They were just using the room. It wasn't our program, et cetera, et cetera. So, and this work can be done by the director and then reviewed by the board, and then discuss, reviewed by a board committee and then discussed with everyone. But there really should be a meaningful risk analysis so that when you're analyzing your current D&O, or if you don't have D&O currently and you're thinking, oh, we maybe need to get some, you have a sense of what are the risks that you're facing. And this is where I mentioned before an insurance advisor. This is where insurance advisors are really handy. It's like those insurance commercials, right? Where they're like, oh, we've seen it all. Yeah, they've seen it all. So they know the things to ask about. Kirsten, I'm going to stop here for a second and see if anyone has any questions.
I think we still need a little clarity regarding writing it into the bylaws versus writing a policy about it, or both. Do you need to have both?
No, you do not need to have both. I think, again, the most important thing is having an insurance policy. That is the most important thing. The insurance policy and making sure that the insurance policy covers the people who would expect to be covered. And if that is not only the board of directors or the board of trustees, depending on the organization, all of the employees who are officers, and maybe even some other employees who are being asked to do some high profile, like who if they have decision-making capability, or if they're getting out there in front of the public speaking for your organization, that's where liability can happen, right? So I just want to be really clear. Of all these things, they're all important. Everything I've said is important, but the most important is that you have a insurance policy if you feel you need one, and that you verify that it covers your library and the people that you want it to cover, right? That is the most important thing. After that, once you have that, once you've verified that, it is definitely helpful in many ways, including, in fact, a big one is recruitment. Recruitment is huge because, like I said, experienced not-for-profit leaders, and I think it's always good to have a pipeline of trustees for a museum or a library who you want people who are bringing new energy and new ideas, and maybe they don't have 30 years of board experience, but you also want your highly experienced people. The highly experienced people, when I'm invited to a board, first thing I do, can I see your bylaws? Can I see your insurance policy? I mean, how could I not do that, right? However, if I look at the bylaws and I don't see it in there, but I see the insurance policy and I see the coverage is right there, I can live with that. I can live with that. So that being said, it's also not only for recruiting trustees, for recruiting directors, right? So every director who's listening right now knows it would be good, right? It would be good to have this assurance in the bylaws. It would be good to have this assurance in my hire letter. It would be good to have this assurance in a contract. And it definitely is good. But it's meaningless if the insurance policy doesn't back up what the representations are. Well, not meaningless, but it means the institution is going to take the financial hit for the indemnification. Because if insurance coverage isn't covering the lawyers and any damages, then the library itself is going to be the one that's paying the bills, right? Does that, are we getting any more questions than that?
That
Yeah.
sounds like it answers a lot of the questions. Hey, how
Good.
about umbrella policies? Do they cover D&O?
Oh my goodness. They can. Usually umbrella is secondary coverage, right? So an umbrella policy is something that goes over all your other coverages. And it's, especially for larger organizations, it's a good idea. And it's a good idea in case you get multiple hits, right? So as I've mentioned, there are policies that, maybe they tank out at 1 million or 3 million total claims, right? And maybe they're limiting, every claim to 1 million. Even if you have 3 million in coverage, every claim is only going to get up to 1 million. There are different kinds of policies, including what's called an umbrella, that will come over and say, oh, oops, did you hit, right? Did you hit your limit on your general premises liability or your directors and officers? Or if anyone out there has a library that owns a boat, there's marine insurance, right, for that. If you have an old boiler, sometimes there are insurance policies for like boilers that are separate from everything else, right? You can get boiler insurance. There's insurance for almost everything. Umbrella can sometimes say, you know, for the following policies, if you go over and above, yes, you can get that. So, and a different policy might even just say, you know, we're gonna be your one-stop shop policy, but in reality, what it's doing is still giving you premises liability, directors and officers insurance, maybe inland marine, maybe not, right? All these other things. Okay. So some things to think about, because I'm going to linger for more questions, but I'm mindful that we are scheduled to go until 11:30, and I just want to make sure we've gone through what I said we would go through. But I will stick if Tessa and Carolyn will stick, I'll stick for additional questions. So things to consider when shopping for D&O. This is something I'm seeing in some of these Cadillac plans I was talking about. And honestly, even though I'm calling them Cadillac plans, they don't cost much more than some of the other plans that I've been looking at. Does the carrier offer a pre-termination hotline? So as we've reviewed, directors and officers insurance can cover wrongful termination of employment. Who doesn't want you to terminate someone wrongfully? The insurance carrier, who would be paying out the damages for the wrongful termination. So a lot of carriers who offer wrongful termination coverage also have a pre-termination hotline that you call and you say, we can't stand it anymore. We have to terminate this person. Here's what we're going to do. And the insurance carrier actually has someone on the other end who says, hold on, right? Have you done the following? Boom, 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 boom. And they will help out with that. That can be, so, you know, ESLN has the Ask the HR service, and we do some of that, but this is another example of that, right? So it's some backup to help you on things that are related to insurance claims. Another one, does the deductible require the organization to have a certain amount ready in a contingency fund? We talked about that, right? So, you know, if you're going to pick a plan with a high deductible, make sure you have that money available in case there is a claim, because the carrier won't start paying until you've hit that deductible amount. So does the carrier come with a good recommendation about responsiveness? So I have never started an actual like rating system. I probably should have at this point. I could have sold it, but anyway, some carriers are just not good, right? So maybe the insurance coverage is actually there. Maybe they're going to pay, but that, you know, when do you know you've got a really good carrier? Is when a claim comes in. You're being threatened with a lawsuit. You're being threatened with a defamation suit, right? All these things, or you've actually been sued, or, you know, the process server has just, you know, like, oh, you've been served, right? And you call the carrier and say, they're threatening to sue us, or they've actually sued us. And they say, calm down. It's all good. Tell us what's happening, right? Okay, we're going to get an attorney set up. We're going to assign someone. You do nothing, just send us the information. Anything else comes in, send them to us, right? With a good insurance carrier, they make a decision about whether or not you actually have coverage that applies to that particular claim within 24 hours, and they are in there helping you immediately. I've seen other carriers take a month to make a decision about, is this a claim we cover or not? Meanwhile, you know, my client is sweating, wondering, do we have insurance coverage, right? So a really good practice, as you're all starting to talk to each other about this, is to seek out recommendations, not just for who has the most affordable, but when they were called, who like really rose to the occasion. And I've seen some great carriers who, you know, they just like knocked it out of the park, gold stars all around. And it truly is, it's a game changer, you know, for, you know, when people are facing that kind of threat. Even if you're told you've been indemnified, even if you're told there's insurance, it's really nerve-wracking to be threatened with any kind of legal action. For the average person, it's very nerve-wracking. Knowing that there's a carrier who's stepping in, right, to be that shield, that's important. And so asking around, and a good place to ask, I would say, for those of you who have connections at your local higher ed institutions, higher ed institutions have to have really good insurance. I say this as a former higher ed executive, right? This is where I learned a lot of my insurance game from. And so they know, They know, and sometimes they will be in a position as a fellow educational institution, right, to share some of their positive experiences and say, oh, hey, call so-and-so. They were great, right? Definitely take recommendations. Okay, really important. It is important within your organization to determine when there is a possible claim, who is going to put the carrier on notice of the claim. Is it the director? Is it the executive committee? Is it an assistant director? Is it if you're at a larger organization, you might even have a business manager, right? Who's managing all the different policies, including the insurance policies, right? Who is the person who does that? I would say that's an important thing. If you end up adopting a policy about D&O, part of the policy should say, when there is a possible claim, the whomever will be the liaison with the insurance carrier. And then designating an alternate, because you don't want, if a claim comes in when the designated person is away on vacation, you want to have an alternate person who can help with that. Really important, where is the copy of the policy being kept? As I mentioned, I always have to print, when I do analysis on these forms, I have to print them out, right? But definitely keep it electronically and make sure it's available on a database so that you don't have to be on premises at the library. It should be considered confidential. It should be kept in a confidential manner. I would say if you ever get foiled for these policies, I would say don't immediately provide a copy, but take a look, because there may be grounds for it to be considered a private document and for you to not have to provide it under FOIL. So just to mention this, but have it available so that if a claim comes in, you're able to assess it and you know who you're talking, you know how to move forward with that claim. Really important, and this is another thing, if you decide to adopt a policy about having a D&O insurance policy, how often is the policy rebid? There's no rule on this. It's as you've probably gathered by all the work we've gone through, it can be a lot of work, but at least every 3 years is a good idea. Your risks will change. You don't want to pay for too much insurance. You don't want to pay for insurance you're never ever going to use. At the same time, you don't want to be underinsured. So looking at, okay, what risks are we taking, right? Where are our exposures? What's our sweet spot for insurance, right? That's a really good thing, by the way, because trustees are in charge of adopting the budget. To me, this is a good exercise for trustees to do. So when you have coverage in place, who evaluates the policy and recommends that the board purchases it? This should be the employee in charge, right? As they know the day-to-day risks. So this is where, at the end of the day, probably the director, the executive director, is the person to say, yes, we know we want the following coverages because we know we engage in the following things. But it doesn't have to be, and again, it can be outsourced as well. Okay, and let's see here. Yep, so very important. When an injury or a threat or a claim comes in, whether it's going to be covered by your D&O, general premises liability, if you have a boat, your marine insurance, right? Obviously stay calm. Don't email back and forth a lot, especially if you're a foilable institution, right? Consult your policy. It should say call your lawyer. You can also calm your lawyer. I tend to stay pretty frosty on these things, because it's my job to remain calm. But yes, call your lawyer, document if it's a claim once you have everything else in place, right? Notify the carrier. You have to notify your carrier as soon as possible. Stay in touch with the carrier until they make a decision about whether or not there's coverage, and keep all the records. And now, look at that. We got through everything. We got 1 minute, and I'm happy to take questions for as long as people want to take questions. And I'm also going to check my list of preset questions to make sure. I think I got to everything. I would say we did get one question about if you're unincorporated. That is definitely a different animal. Yes, that's different. If you are serving, if you're volunteering for an unincorporated entity, that is, I wouldn't say just go with what I've said here. That's a completely different thing. So, all right. Any questions? Otherwise, first I'm going to say thank you for
Yes,
everybody, to who we're going to release. Thank you so much for attending. I appreciate it. We definitely welcome any feedback, especially any feedback that you think that would make this better. I realize it was a lot of information to throw at you, and comments and feedback are very, very appreciated. So, and with that, like I said, we'll formally end, but I'm going to stick around for questions.
and all images are Creative Commons from the Metropolitan Museum. Or no, this was Smithsonian, wasn't it?
Thanks. No, I think this is Matt. Thank you, Matt.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Matt. We have a question. As a new board president, I do not know if we have D&O. Our director is new in his role, with little turnover from the previous director. Would our attorney be the correct starting place?
So if there's one thing I can say about directors and officers insurance that does apply universally, it's that it's not free, right? So I would say take a look at, because if you are a new trustee at a library, one of the things that is your responsibility is approving all of the vouchers for payment. And that would include the payment of the insurance premium. So take a look. So number one, if you see no sign that an insurance premium is being paid for, that's right. That's a sign right there that maybe there isn't D&O, or that might be the sign that the D&O is coming from another place. And from the, your village, your town, et cetera, et cetera. The lawyer would be a good start, but again, like, especially because libraries try to be very budget conscious when they use lawyers, right? Lawyers are expensive no matter what. So the lawyer might not have all the records. So the lawyer would know, especially if there's been a claim, they would have I have a copy of the insurance coverage of different libraries that I've helped when they had a claim, because it's the first thing I'm going to say is send me a copy of the policy, right? But the lawyer might not know. So I would say look for clues about payment. And that should even show which carrier is being paid. And then you can contact the carrier and just request a copy of the current policies, right? Policy or policies, insurance policies. And it's a little trickier if you find out that, well, we think we get policy through the town or village. Then it really would be, you would probably ask, the town clerk, the supervisor, like someone who has access to those things. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
In assessing risk, is there some industry standard for various activities? How do we compare our activities to determine if we have a risk compared to other libraries?
It's a good question. So I think okay, I'm going to answer the question. I am not aware of anything like that. However, I will say that insurance carriers typically, to get the kinds of coverage we're talking about, an insurance carrier will send your institution a very big questionnaire. And those questionnaires often use that to develop the quote for the policy. So it might be that the process of shopping for D&O might actually help you conduct that risk analysis. I think other than that, like if you do a search for risk management libraries, you're probably going to find a lot. I will do some follow-up on that. That's a great question.
What happens when two villages share a library and split expenses, but only one of those villages is chartered as the library? Several trustees live in the other village and therefore not a resident of the chartered community. What happens then, and what should those unaffiliated trustees do and ask of the charter village?
So annually asking for a copy of the policy that covers the trustees, and then making sure the carrier is confirming that all of the trustees are covered. That would be the way to do that. Yes. Because
Okay.
only once the carrier confirms in writing would you really know. It's a good question.
If your friends and or foundation pays for some of your programming instead of the library, would the library's D&O still need to cover possible breach of contract? Do we need to see insurance policies from friends and or foundation?
Okay. So if your library is either the location or is on the contract in any way, then your library should be making sure that your coverage covers that event, no matter who's paying for it, right? If you're co-presenting something, both organizations should have coverage for it, except and you'll see this in a lot of rental contracts, and I've actually put this kind of language in rental contracts where library space is being rented. So if an outside organization is coming in and using library space, the contract should say, we, the organization coming in to use your space, are going to indemnify you, the library, for anything that happens during our event or as a result of our event, and we have insurance to cover that. And here's proof of that insurance. So that's how that should work. Who's paying for things? Sometimes on a practical level, that does become relevant because sometimes personal injury attorneys and other attorneys who would bring a legal claim, they'll try to follow the money. But just because an organization is paying for something doesn't necessarily mean they are on the hook for the actual for an incident that happened at that event or because of that. Yeah, that's a good question.
Okay. If a covered trustee leaves the organization after a lawsuit has been ongoing for a while, are they still covered?
So yeah, if the trustee leaves and the litigation is continuing, unless at some point, so once a legal claim gets moving and it starts being investigated, someone who was indemnified and covered, if it's found out that they actually acted negligently, like with gross negligence or even intent to harm the institution, they could lose that indemnification, whether or not they remain affiliated with the institution. But if the trustee leaves, they're still going to retain the coverage for the time, that relates to the incident. So yes, if they leave, they still have that coverage. If a new incident is alleged to happen, they wouldn't have coverage, but also they probably wouldn't be named in it because they're not affiliated with the library anymore.
What is the reason for not answering a FOIL request for the D&O policy? Isn't this a public document paid for by the taxpayers?
It might be. However, there are many reasons under FOIL to deny a FOIL request. And one of the things that will sometimes happen is people will look for insurance coverage. So you don't always want people to know how much insurance coverage there is, because then they will target the institution for claims. And a great example is copyright trolls. If they know that the coverage is out there. So I would just say it may be that they have to be released, but rather than automatically releasing the insurance policy, just pause a minute, see what's being requested. You don't get to ask why, right? But just take a look and just make sure. It may be that under FOIL you have to release it, but it's definitely one where I would encourage just take for the records information officer to take a pause and just say, okay, we have this policy. It shows our deductible. It shows our premium that we pay. It shows how much coverage we have. It shows what we're covered for. Is there any reason to, are we currently in litigation, right? And it may be that there's no reason to deny it, but I just want to encourage take a pause and just think. And it may be, oh, nope, there's no legitimate reason to not provide this. But definitely just take a pause before it's provided. You have time, right? Under FOIL, you get a FOIL request. You have 5 days to even reply, to acknowledge the FOIL request. You have at least another 20 days after that initial reply to, deny it, partially fulfill it, or to ask for more time if you need it.
Oh, could you put the previous screen up, please? Okay. Let me scan the chat for a moment. So we did get a couple in the chat. No, we've answered those. I don't see any that we didn't answer.
Okay.
Lots of thank yous.
Well, I'm glad everybody hung in there because this is a lot, but hopefully there's some good tips in there. All right, so Carolyn and Tessa, I think we're good.
Someone wanted to confirm that slides will be provided.
I guess what we'll do is we can take the takeaways, some of the takeaway slides, and absolutely, but all the content on the slides for the most part was provided on the analysis sheet. So, but yeah, we can do that.
And they're all on the recording too.
That's
So
true.
we'll send the recording and a link with the sheet and the evaluation and a CE certificate request.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right. I think we're good.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Stephanie.
Somebody wants to know if they have an outside pavilion, should they post that it's not available for after hours or non-library use?
Oh, that's about general premises liability, but I'll just say that would be a part of the puzzle, but got to look at the full thing. So I have to duck and cover on that question. Sorry.
Beyond the scope, beyond the scope.
It's a good question though.
Is there a certificate of attendance? Does it count towards required CE?
Yep, I just linked to that above in the chat if you scroll all the way up, but I'll be sending that out with the recording if you missed it.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the snow or the not snow. Take care.
Bye.